Well, as I said, I've written in today's Sydney Daily Telegraph, Brisbane's Courier Mail and the Gold Coast Bulletin about the extraordinary decision by the Australian government to not only ban Australians in India from coming home, but also threaten them with jail. I note the West Australian Premier and his government's 3 Indian-born MPs have come under attack from Perth's Indian community over the support by McGowan for the Australian government ban. And they're saying that Perth's Indian community, that they've been exposed to racism. Now, I'm not saying the decision by the Morrison government is racist, but it gives the impression to the wider community that Indians have the potential to put the health of Australians at risk, and therefore members of the Indian family, and we love our Indian friends, they have come under attack. No matter which way you look at it, even though the government is now backtracking at 100 miles an hour, whoever devised this response is totally and politically inept. As I've said this week, you even got the Prime Minister and the Chief Medical Officer arguing with one another. The Prime Minister said he had clear advice from his Chief Medical Officer that no Australian in India should be allowed to return. The Chief Medical Officer, Professor Kelly, said, quote, "I didn't advise anything in relation to fines or any of these other matters." Let me repeat, we sympathise with the Indian family, and India and Indians are wonderful friends of ours. As the metaphysical poet John Donne said, any man's death diminishes me because we are part of mankind. But it's the response which is disturbing, bordering on the dishonest, but with the capacity, like everything else, if there's disinformation, to fashion public attitudes. Nikki Sava has written outstandingly in the Australian newspaper about this today when she says, in the face of Josh Frydenberg's defence of the decision, and I quote, "It was impossible not to ponder if Frydenberg would have been as visible in support of his decision if it had been directed at Israel rather than India." She said, "I make the point that these decisions are a direct condemnation by the government of its own failure to provide adequate quarantine facilities. A vote of no confidence, basically, in Australia's quarantine system." Nikki Sava makes the point, and I quote, "Morrison's had 14 months to expand existing or build new quarantine facilities," unquote. It seems the Chief Medical Officer, Paul Kelly, was quick to state where the responsibility for the decision lay, talking about the risks associated with travel from India, which I'll show in a minute can't be justified. The Chief Medical Officer, Paul Kelly, said, quote, "And then the response to that was obviously the decision of government to use the Biosecurity Act in that way," unquote. As Nikki Sava points out, Scott Morrison's been a bit careless with his language. He claimed the government's action towards Australians in India was similar to those taken previously to other countries, which isn't true. Travel bans have been imposed, but Australians in other countries weren't told if they came home they could be jailed. As Nikki Sava writes, the least every citizen should expect is that if they're in danger somewhere, their government will not forsake them, cancel them, but move heaven and earth to get them home. Now, look, I brought my passport in here tonight. You've all got a passport, and inside the back cover, the front cover, there's the front cover of it, then turn it inside, and it says here inside, turn it upside down, and it makes the point. And it says this is the passport which is issued by the Australian government, and it does, it's very small print, it may concern to allow that the bearer, an Australian citizen, to pass freely without, it says, without let or hindrance. Let is a biblical word which means a sort of an obstacle. Without let or hindrance, and to afford him or her every assistance and protection of which he or she may stand in need. Well, there is the government. What it's done in relation to India. I mean, if this was to happen to every other country, we'd have to cancel flights from most of the rest of the world, where death and infection rates as a percentage of the population are similar or worse than those in India. For example, the death rate in India is 0.176% of the population, almost identical to Spain. But the death rate in England is 0.22%. In Italy, 0.20%. Do we cancel Australians in England, Spain and Italy and threaten them with jail if they come home? Rabia Sadiq is an Australian of Indian heritage. Her family's in India. She's a criminal and human rights lawyer, a retired British Army officer, an author, a professional speaker. She joins me from Perth. Rabia, thank you for your time. How are your family managing in India?
Good evening, Alan. Thank you. Look, as you can imagine, all my father's family almost are still in India. Anyone with any resources or that was well enough to travel and flee the country did so weeks and months ago. But, those that don't have resources, my elderly relatives, those that have got very serious medical conditions have had to stay. They're distressed, they're paralysed with fear. It's testing their mental and their physical resilience and their faith.
I can understand that. What about then, as an Indian families, India backwards, what about this travel ban?
Oh, Alan, where do I begin? I've given you a little bit of a personal perspective of what my family and millions of Indians and Indian families are going through, and you've seen some of the pictures. From a human rights perspective, as 20 plus years practicing in this area, I'm dumbfounded. I'm still almost in disbelief. You've gone on record and stated it very well, and I have to say, Alan, there's a lot of things we don't agree on, but on this we are absolutely on the same page. It is absolutely in contravention to our international legal obligations that we as a country signed up to many, many years ago.
Well, Sadiq, I just made the point inside my passport. There it is. It guarantees you.
That's right.
So you might as well rip it up.
Absolutely. It's unlawful on many levels. So, very quickly, it's contravening our international legal obligations under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. I would just encourage anyone to read Article 12. It is contrary to our democratic principles as a Western democracy. It is well in excess and exceeds the government's powers under the Commonwealth Biosecurity Act. It is disproportionate. It is overly restrictive and intrusive, as the wording of the Act details, and it is against public law principles of consistency, transparency, and due process. And of course, now we know that it is being tested and challenged in the federal court as being unconstitutional. So I'm appalled, and as you said, it may not be racist. But you tell me then what the thinking behind it is.
Well, the consequences are racist, aren't they? Because people who don't know much, they just read the headlines, they listen to the Prime Minister, and they think all these Indian people now are jeopardising the health of Australians, these terrible Indian people. I mean, it's very unfair.
This is the fear. This is the fear. I'm sure you have many friends and I have many friends of Chinese heritage. And what so many of our Australians that have Chinese heritage went through last year, in terms of victimisation and racism and discrimination, the fear amongst a lot of the Indian community is that this is what, the lay person will be thinking now, that Indians are endangering and keep them out. But as you said, when you look at the facts and when you look at the percentage of the population, why aren't European or Australian citizens trying to come back from Europe being criminalised? Why weren't Australians that were trying to return from the US and the UK at the height of their spikes?
Absolutely.
This is inconsistent.
100% correct. See, Rabia, I mean, it's hard to believe that all politicians agree with this. Are they too gutless or are they too timid to speak out?
Look, it will be interesting to see what happens over the next few days as this is being tested in the federal court. It is a fact that both parties, members of parliament from both parties, crossbenchers, have come out and appealed to Scott Morrison to reverse this decision. So, there is bipartisan condemnation of it. But you're right, no one from my understanding, has been very vocal.
Well, they've waited for the public. They've waited until it was safe. They've waited for the public outrage and then got on the wagon.
Absolutely.
But they weren't there at the beginning. Rabia, my thoughts.
Leadership, Alan.
Yeah, absolutely. My thoughts are with you and your family and all our Indian friends. And while I'm talking to you, I've got to say to you, one of my favourite restaurants in Sydney is the Malabar restaurant up at King's Cross. And so to Mohammed and Emily, we were talking to them last night and they are as distressed as you are. So thank you for joining us tonight. I'm very grateful.
Thank you, Alan.
There she is. That is Rabia Sadiq, a criminal and human rights lawyer, a retired British Army officer, an author and a professional speaker, and as I said, of Indian heritage.